Claire Dutrieu takes us behind the scenes of a political affair that marked the history of France, the Dreyfus affair.
It all begins on Rue de Lille in Paris at the German embassy. This is Madame Bastien, the embassy housekeeper. In fact, Madame Bastien is a member of the French counter-espionage service. Every day she pretends to empty the garbage and takes the contents back to Commandant Henri. On this day in September 1894, she found a letter in the garbage, which would be known as the memorandum. A letter torn into 6 large pieces, unsigned and undated, addressed to the German military attaché at the German embassy, Max von Schwarzkoppen. The memorandum refers to confidential French military documents that are to be handed over to a foreign power. The Minister of War ordered an investigation, and an ideal culprit was identified. It was Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He's at Army headquarters, so he has access to important documents. He's from Alsace, so he speaks German, which makes it easy for him to talk to the enemy. And above all, he's Jewish. At the end of the 19th century, still reeling from the humiliation of the loss of Alsace and Lorraine, France was facing an upsurge in nationalism as well as an outburst of anti-Semitism. Captain Dreyfus firmly denied it, but the army would have none of it. A relentless machine was set in motion. How to summarize the incredible succession of lies? Forged documents, false and misleading claims, obstructing the inquiry, and violations of due process by the military forces and their courts. Dreyfus's handwriting does not match that of the memorandum. It doesn't matter. A so-called expert develops the theory of self-forging. Dreyfus invented this new form of writing. Arrested on October 15th, Dreyfus refused to confess. A gun was placed on the table to make him commit suicide. He did not. He was convicted of intelligence with the enemy and incarcerated in total secrecy. At the end of October, an anti-Semitic newspaper, The Free Speech, revealed the affair and raged against Dreyfus. It was the start of an anti-Semitic campaign that spread throughout France. Dreyfus's brother Mathieu Dreyfus hired the best lawyers. They were all convinced that their client would emerge from the court-martial with his name cleared. This was without taking into account the dishonesty of the prosecution. As there was no evidence, Captain Dreyfus risked being exonerated. The army then brandishes a secret file that it cannot disclose, which supposedly contains 4 pieces of evidence proving Dreyfus's guilt. Later, much later, the file turned out to be empty. Dreyfus was sentenced to perpetual incarceration in a penal colony and demoted of his military rank. The newspapers are overflowing with anti-Semitism. The country regretted that he was not sentenced to death. On January 5th, a terrible ceremony took place in the courtyard of the military academy in front of 4,000 soldiers and 20,000 spectators. His insignia, the fine gold straps of his braids, the facings of his sleeves and jacket were torn off. The condemned man's saber was broken. Witnesses note Dreyfus's dignity as he proclaims his innocence while raising his arms. Soldiers, an innocent man is disgraced, an innocent man is dishonored. Long live France, long live the army. Dreyfus sets sail for Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana. He and his guards are the only inhabitants. Living conditions were appalling. The heat was unbearable, the food adulterated. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he was struck down by tropical diseases. In Paris, his brother fights on. He deploys unparalleled energy to clear his brother's name. The first to join him was a moderate journalist, Bernard Lazare. Little by little, he succeeded in getting the irregularity of the trial heard. The Dreyfusards, as the defenders of Dreyfus are called, organized themselves. Supported by anti-military groups, they demanded a retrial. The army got scared and manufactured forgeries to strengthen the so-called evidence against Dreyfus. But a certain lieutenant colonel, Georges Picard, looked into the case and unmasked the real culprit. The author of the memo is a French officer in debt from gambling, Commander Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. The Army General Staff did not see it that way. They won't recognize a wrongful conviction. The army with its cohort of false documents were unleashed against Picard. He was transferred to Tunisia and then imprisoned. As for the guilty Esterhazy, he was simply acquitted at a sham trial and exiled to England, where he lived happily until his death in 1920. All the while, France was breaking apart. Public opinion raged against the Jews. Anti-Dreyfus riots, defamatory and anti-Semitic campaigns. This is too much for a number of people ulcerated by these violations of the spirit of the Republic. Behind the Dreyfusards of the first hour, Mathieu Dreyfus and Bernard Lazare, politicians like Clemenceau and Léon Blum, writers like Octave Mirbeau and Anatole France, and above all, Émile Zola. Émile Zola, a writer at the height of his fame, used his popularity to defend Dreyfus. On January 13, 1898, the newspaper The Aurora published a letter from Zola to the French President Félix IV. 6 columns on the newspaper's front page, topped by the famous "I accuse you." The Aurora normally printed 30,000 copies, but on that day, it sold 300,000. Zola takes the whole affair from the beginning. He accuses the falsifiers, the army, and the Minister of War. His goal? To be indicted so that the irregularities of the Dreyfus trial can be revealed. The violence surrounding Zola's defamation trial is unimaginable. Zola must be protected. France is now divided into 2 camps, the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. It was in this context that the term intellectual was coined to designate the writers, jurists, and academics who took a stand in public debate, particularly here in favor of Dreyfus. In short, Zola was convicted of defaming the army, but his aim was achieved. The general public was informed of the sordid details of the Dreyfus trial. Ex-Captain Dreyfus was unaware of all this. He survives in a pitiful state on his desert island, subjected to the cruelties of his overseers. The Dreyfus affair had long since become an affair of state, leading to fearsome instability within the government. In 1898, a retrial became inevitable. Dreyfus was brought back to France. The retrial opened in the city of Rennes on August 7, 1899. The tension was extreme and Rennes was under siege. The absence of charges against Dreyfus is clear, yet he is sentenced again. 10 years imprisonment instead of perpetual deportation and once again demoted. Dreyfus was still guilty, but with extenuating circumstances. Finally, he was offered a pardon, which the exhausted Dreyfus finally accepted, to the great displeasure of the Dreyfusards, who wanted to obtain his acquittal. Dreyfus, as if he wasn't burdened enough already, found himself alone, abandoned by most of his supporters. Dreyfus is released from prison on September 21, 1899. But it wasn't until 1906, after many twists and turns, that Alfred Dreyfus was finally rehabilitated. He took part in the World War I and died in 1935. It's an understatement to say that the Dreyfus affair had a profound impact on French society. It led to an exacerbation of anti-Semitism, which would find its fulfillment in the Vichy policies following the capitulation to Germany in 1940. It divided France into a left-wing Dreyfusards and a right-wing anti-Dreyfusards majority. It raised awareness in intellectual circles of their role in the national debate. The Dreyfus affair led to the creation of the Human Rights League. Internationally, the Dreyfus affair was not without consequences. It was at the origin of the creation of Zionism, a movement driven by the Austro-Hungarian Jewish journalist Theodor Herzl, who watched the trial in horror for Vienna's new free press. From now on, he would devote his life to creating a territory for the world's Jews. This will be Israel. If you want to understand contemporary France, you need to know about this appalling affair, which a century later still haunts the collective memory of the French people.